Our disability is our greatest strength. It gives us the supervision to see the issues facing humanity from a more inclusive perspective and the grit to fight back against all odds. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the More Than Walking Video podcast discussion. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the podcast where people of all abilities gather to discuss pressing issues that affect the disability community and their implications for the world at large. We are your hosts. I am Corey Pheez Lee, C4 complete quadriplegic since 2005.
And I'm Jonathan Sigworth, C7 complete quadriplegic since 2006, both of us hailing from the great state of Connecticut.
And let me tell you why Connecticut is so great. It's because the UConn women won the national championship. So if you guys, who are listening out there, if you're not from Connecticut, you can't enjoy this celebration and this win. But we're definitely grateful for that that championship and bring another chip home, which is cool. But we are recording this on Thursday, the 10th of April, 2025, and in a little bit, we'll be discussing education. Imagine schools out forever.
Just as a reminder, Super Adaptables is made possible in part this year by a grant from the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center. The information provided and opinions expressed in these podcasts do not necessarily reflect the views of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. For more information about the Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center, visit www.christopherreeve.org. Also, I should note that the views expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of More Than Walking either, but belong to us as individual speakers.
That's right. And, starting off this conversation, I automatically, as a, recording artist, I think about music, right? And one of the most notable songs ever recorded is School's Out, Time for Summer. And it's been over 50 years since Alice Cooper released their most notable hit in 1972. Its lyrics resonate today as federal systems, funding, and protections for education are being dismantled. The lyrics kind of go like this: no more pencils, no more books, no more teachers, goes the song. And out for summer, out till fall, we might not come back at all.
And, for example, in March, the federal government laid off 1,315 Department of Education employees, nearly half of all staff in the smallest cabinet-level agency that has been responsible for, among other things, protecting civil rights, funding low-income schools, providing vocational rehab for people with disabilities, guaranteeing disability accommodations, managing student loans and grants, and conducting educational research to figure out what works, what doesn't in education, among other things. So what are the potential impacts of this development, and how do we value the educational supports we have personally experienced?
Yeah, and I think, that's the question at hand, when I think back to being a kid, right? And I question what was my least or favorite part of school as it pertains to having to get up, the earlier, the more you progress in school, not realizing that there has been so many policies enacted that allow me to go to school. And I wish I had more appreciation, because I know, like many of us, we sit back and we look at the bills and we go, I can't stand adulting, and I don't want to have the adult for one more second, and wishing I could go back to school. But that's the question at hand. What was your least or favorite part of school? My favorite part was gym and recess. And so, John, how about you? What was your least or favorite part of school?
I mean, thinking about all this, it also makes me reflect on, the value of education in particular. And I think the most favorite part of school was, I always loved English class. I always loved discussing literature, writing essays, arguing with other students, and I think we're seeing this a lot, the ability to explore ideas that you didn't necessarily grow up with, that you didn't necessarily were exposed to at home, really owning your own beliefs and wrestling with difficult questions. That's what I got from English class. You build your own philosophical view of the world, through the experience of others, whether it's through fiction or nonfiction, and so that's something I really valued, and hope that we can preserve to the extent possible.
No, I agree with that. And I would say too, in terms of class, English was one of my favorites. definitely. And as you express, like being able to open up a book and explore different world views, even if they don't agree with your own, the point is you're able to critically think and formulate
Hmm.
an opinion on matters that are different from yours, but you don't have to show any type of disrespect because of that. But with that said, we want to welcome the other super adaptables with us today. And as we call on you, say hello, your name, where you're calling in from, if you have a disability or not, and briefly, what was your least or favorite part of school? And Brandon, kick us off.
Hello, my name's Brandon Patterson, 40 years old from Colorado. I'm a C6, C7 complete quad from 2017 in a motor vehicle accident. And, like, okay, so what era are we talking about school here? High
It
school.
doesn't matter.
Your
Elementary, high
favorite
school.
from the whole thing.
It doesn't matter whichever era.
Hands down from school was girls, man. Like, there were women everywhere, and, like, that was just it. Now I'm in school again after all these years, and I'd have to say though my favorite now is history. Man, I will get lost even if I'm not even in my history class. I watch documentaries and everything I can find on history as much as I can get it now. So that's my favorite.
Awesome, awesome. Definitely doomed to repeat it if you forget it, right? Cool, nice. Bernadette.
Yes,
Hey,
I'm Benedict. Benedict, 59 T10, spinal injury. I enjoyed being in class. In Kenya, mostly, most of us attend classes. So most of the things I liked, their games we played together with the other kids. I really enjoyed that company, a lot to learn from others, and participated in games. And when you're at home alone, it's hard to do it. So I learned a lot from class, learning a lot of activities, being able to help where I cannot do my assignment. So liked the being in the class. The company
nice.
matters a lot.
Yeah, company does matter. Kids barely play anymore, but they do play video games. So hopefully we can get them back outside. But thank you for that, Amy.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Garcia from Bloomfield, Connecticut, age 41. I am not disabled. I work in education at an alternative school. And growing up, I enjoyed every subject except English. So every subject. I loved art. I loved science, history, everything else. But English was my fearful subject. But again, I'm here to support on your education aspect and role. And I'm looking forward to diving in a little deeper with you guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Lynn.
Hey, I'm Lynn, from Connecticut. I was injured in 93, C6, C7. Definitely my favorite part of school was during college. I learned the most. You interacted with different people. Science and math were definitely my strong suits all along. I was manager of the UConn women's
There we go.
basketball team when I was at UConn, which was an incredible experience. And I'll tell you that Gino Oriema is one of the greatest all-time coaches. He helped me with wheelchair, quad rugby and in so many different aspects of my life, even coaching high school basketball, which I did.
That's incredible. So listen, we're going to just jump right into it. So obviously, there's been so much talk about the cuts that Doge has been performing for the sake of eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse and promoting government efficiency. But it seems a bit questionable just because it's so abrupt and in an age where we can we have hyperconnectivity with one another. These newsreels, and it flashes before our eyes, and it hits us kind of like out of left field, and we just don't know what to do or what to expect. And most people are concerned with what's happening. So, with question one, what is your view of the Department of Education? In what ways could it be improved besides mass termination? And do you think the layoffs will lead to greater efficiency? And if anything, what has shaped your perspective on this issue, John?
The Department of Education, in my mind, I guess I have a positive view of it. I spent most of my life not really paying attention to the structure of education in my state or in the country, just kind of taking things for granted, I suppose. But in general, I've had a good experience, so I have a good view of the Department of Education. I'm not convinced that mass termination is the best way to improve any kind of department, especially when learning that they're in charge of, as I mentioned before, grants, research, funding for students, funding for schools. There's a lot of tasks, and when you reduce staff, that doesn't make things go more smoothly. And if you're going to be introducing technology, that takes time, and kind of abrupt changes are not necessarily good. So I guess, what has shaped my perspective on this issue, like vocational rehab, which is, instrumental for people with disabilities to get back to driving, to get back to employment, post-injury, that's run by the Department of Education. I did not know that. So like the more I'm learning, like the more I'm realizing, wow, like it's such an important function. It's a complex situation. So that's what I've learned. I would love to hear from Brandon what you think about the Department of Education.
I mean, even though I'm going to school, and obviously the Department of Education to do their jobs, I don't think anybody's been doing their jobs for a long, long time. So I don't have any really big mixed emotions on mass layoffs. I mean, somebody's got to do some kind of work somewhere down the line, and if you're not going to do it, then why are you here? I kind of understand that premise behind it, but I think for my fall semester last year, I was just trying to get somebody on the phone just to discuss anything, and I spent almost 3 days basically on hold, like the whole day. Could never get a phone call, couldn't get a phone call back. I could never even get an email back. Nobody wanted to return anything, so I'm hit or miss when it comes to the department of anyway. So as long as they don't start screwing up with scholarships and funding and stuff like that, then I'm okay at the moment.
Yeah, I can understand that frustration, not being able to have someone address your issue in a timely fashion. I think that's across the board, whether it's the federal government or your local municipality, if you're trying to speak maybe to the tax assessor or something of that nature. I think there's a problem with how to communicate every piece of information to the public and give the public reassurance. One of the things that we're talking about is like AI, right? AI is supposed to come in and swoop down and kind of like solve our issues, but when you call, who are you normally speaking to? Some AI bot on the other end giving you prompts that only lead you to pressing star, and you may never get to a customer service rep. Yeah. So, most times what do we want? We want a human. And if we want a human, but you're laying off humans, how are you going to make the department, or any piece of government, place of government more efficient? But Amy, I would love for you to chime in, especially what are you seeing like at school when you have to deal with different parents?
Sure. So I work in an alternative school, and people don't realize that the department, what they're laying off, it has nothing to, the misconception with the Department of Education is that it has something to do with the curriculum. And comparing the U.S. to other countries, we might not be as strong, but the Department of Education it highlights special education. It highlights Head Start funds, grants, scholarships, like Brandon expressed. I work in a school where these are children who have been kicked out of their regular, it's a public school that I work at. And these are children that were kicked out of their public school because they have no other option. These students range from age 5 to 22. They might have, I would say about 75% of our students have an IEP, which is considered special education, if you don't know what an IEP is. And sometimes, I'm just saying, if a student is kicked out because they have a gun, the Department of Education still has to provide an education for that student before they do something heinous and end up in juvenile detention or prison or whatever it may be. This department is well needed because it's everything that you might think that it doesn't have anything to do with. But it's so imperative that we keep it, because I'm just saying every town has a certain amount of budget. And one of our students, we do cater to our own district, but any student that's in an outside district within Connecticut, if they're kicked out, they get sent to our school. So if a student, ended up in a physical altercation with a staff member, they were expelled, they might be expelled to our school. Or if they aren't able to receive their special education services within their district, they're going to get sent and referred to an outside district and end up paying almost $60,000 to $140,000. That money goes towards the incoming district that's receiving them. If you take away the funding for these children, and it's not only children with severe behavioral needs, it might be children with autism, it might be children with OHI, which is hearing impaired. It's really crucial that they receive the fair education just like a normal, regular student. And their public systems won't be able to provide them with education. So that's why they get sent to an outside district with the proper education. And taking away Board of Education funds will take away from their services where they might not need or have a place to go. And it's going to be really crucial for outside districts to provide that with equal opportunity. And I just feel like we're in a tough situation where everything is going to be affected for the next 20 to 30 years by them removing district workers.
Wow. I mean, and there's also, you mentioned the funding, but then there's also the oversight, the accountability to make sure that states provide those systems of support that are kicked out of other schools or that other schools can't accommodate. Bernadette, would be curious, what is education? What are the social safety nets for people with disabilities or special needs in Kenya that you know of? And I know that you're a teacher yourself.
Yes, I'm a teacher in public school, and I teach not in a special school, but in a normal school. But I visited before I joined the public school. Right now, there was a school I was teaching, and we had to accommodate the deaf student. So it was a challenge because assistive devices were not usually provided. And also we, as a regular teacher, we had no education. We have not been educated on how to handle students who are deaf. So the government did not fund us to further our studies so that we can take care of the special need. Another problem in education in Kenya, like the public school, we have a problem of funding. We have a new system of education which have been introduced, and the problem is we don't have enough books to cater for the public school students. So those are some of the challenges we face. And then our university funding. There's burden, we have burden, which usually it's not able to identify the poor and the rich. So you find that sometimes the poor kids are out of school because the parent cannot pay their school fees. Thank you.
Yeah, that's like an ongoing and a pervasive problem, I think, all across the board. This idea of really who is entitled to the education. Privately funded schools are, provided for by wealthy parents, while public school is funded on taxpayer dollars. And that disparity is really what causes kids to go by the wayside because, as Amy alluded to, they need certain services that may not be optional elsewhere. Like a parent may not be able to afford to put their kid in counseling, but through the school system, if that child qualifies for like an IEP, they can have access to certain social workers. They can have access to even speech therapy. Maybe it's a child that's nonverbal and they're just acting out. And teachers in a classroom filled with 30 kids are not equipped for that. So they need to be able to, school districts need to be able to hire, para teachers to assist those teachers with, dealing with those kids. And that impact can be just detrimental on their future success. But Lynn, I'd love for you to just add about what shaped your views about the Department of Education.
Really going through the process of vocational rehab. Really brought a lot of things to my attention, and I think what's going on now is critically important to help keep those services going, not just for people with physical disabilities, but all disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as we've been hearing, it's the funding that the Department of Education has provided, which is, as I believe, is the vast majority of its budget. The staff don't cost that much. It's all the grants and the funds that go to the schools, and those programs. And if I want to pivot to the second question that we have, with the recent DEAI initiatives being eliminated, do you think employers will be less discriminatory and hire individuals with disabilities solely based on their educational credentials and job experiences? As a person with a disability, how has education or any form of vocational training impacted you personally?
No, I don't think that when you look at a person on paper, because it's not explicit on your application that you have a disability. But if you go into the office like, okay, hey, we'd like to bring you in for an interview versus somebody else, I think employers or HR or hiring managers, they're going to stop and say, what are we going to do with this individual? And it could be a variety of things, okay? How much assistance does he or she need? Can we accommodate those things? What happens during an emergency? Or, how do we evacuate this person? Even if you are Harvard or an MIT grad or from some type of university, it's just not going to happen. I mean, we're seeing right now funding. I mean, just recently, like funding for, I think it was like Columbia. I think it was like to the tune of 400 million is being taken away because they believe they're sponsoring like terrorism because they're activists or people advocating against, what's happening between Israel and Hamas. And these are just able-bodied people, speaking their mind. If it's in peaceful protests, there should be no issue. So if that can be done to just able-bodied people, I don't see how it's going to be any easier for me to try to get a job solely based off my educational credentials. And as far as just having a disability and the role that education has played in my life is huge. In fact, I had the opportunity to speak to one of my high school teachers in an agricultural program that I was a part of, um, freshman through senior year. And I had to just thank her because of that program. That's why I enjoy peer mentoring, because I was doing peer mentoring as a kid, going to different school districts, talking to kids, enjoying activities, all while it revolved around aquaculture. And it was just a neat program, and it helped me to see the humanity in people even at a young age. So that definitely it was impactful in my life. Brandon, how about you? Especially, you in college. How has education been impactful for you? And what do you think about the discrimination that could or could not happen in job hiring?
That's kind of, again, one of those things I'm right on the fence about. Like, I've thought for many, many years, even before my accident, that I think all job applicants, I think it should be blind interviews, man. No, you should not be able to see the person you're interviewing other than what's on paper. You know what I mean? Like, your credentials, your job experiences, that should be what gets you hired. Not anything, regardless of anybody's anything, should go into play on what's being hired except for your experience. Now that I'm in college and, hopefully going back into the job field that I want to go into with, peer mentoring and counseling people in wheelchairs is what I want to go for. I know no matter what, it's going to be an uphill battle regardless getting into that field. So I already know without any of this happening that I'm already going to be, for lack of a better term, looked down upon because I'm in a wheelchair. You know what I mean? Like, I know that. And I'm part Irish, so I'm always up for a good fight and an argument. So it doesn't really bother me. Like, let's go. I'm down to get in the ring, go a couple rounds, and I will fight for a job. I got no problem.
Brandon, you reminded me that the Department of Education, another role I believe it has is it helps make sure that employers do not discriminate against people with disabilities. It's pretty difficult for an individual to go, if you're hired and you're denied an accommodation or something like that, or they fire you unjustly, it's pretty hard for you to go by yourself up against a big corporation or a big company. That's what the Department of Education does, is they file those suits, and they're able to short circuit the process to really, force companies to follow the law. So that's another kind of vital role that they're playing. But yeah, it's a challenging environment. Amy, we'll come back to you. What do you see, as you're interacting with students, who are going through disability or other challenges? How do you see, the current landscape, either with existing supports or how things may turn out in terms of future employment for them? How are you viewing their future?
There's uncertainty with these students. I think with what's going on in today's world, I see more students dropping out of school. I see that they're going to reach a point where they're old enough. Maybe they're 15, maybe they're 14, 16. They're going to reach a point where, because they don't have access to certain services and there isn't enough teachers to support them, staff, I feel like they're just going to end up dropping out with less hires. And it's unfortunate because we're seeing that now. They have a tremendous amount of support, but when they reach a certain age in high school, they give up on themselves. And I think that I wish they were able to come in and really work on themselves before going to anyone else for help. But it's hard when they've been through so much trauma. A lot of students who end up in our school, they've been through tons of trauma. And we don't have, it's also students with just maybe a higher level of anxiety. That's why they end up in our school as well. And they need that smaller setting. I think funds will disappear if they're not able to go to an outside school, if their town doesn't offer it. I just feel as though they're going to fall short. There's many families that don't support their students' education. and they're going to end up at home, probably forgotten about. And that's what we don't want. We want to push education as much as we can in our country. And I think we're in a state where I think Connecticut really cares about everyone's education. And you compare our state to maybe the South or maybe states out west, it's going to be harder for those states to get any type of funding. And that's what the Department of Education fought for, is that it's equal opportunity in every state, every town. And if they get rid of that, who else is going to fight for our students?
Yeah, and that is definitely, I think, at the heart of the matter is, the adults are in charge, but who's fighting for the kids? Yeah, that's real.
I didn't know that in America you have such kind of problem we have in Kenya. I remember when I was a teacher before the accident. So I stayed for around a year, and I found it hard to come back to job. I have to inform my officers to go and request for my re-employment, because it is not easy for a person on a wheelchair to be employed unless you work very hard. So I'm also wondering on a student, because here we have also same challenges of students not being able to attend school because the parents are poor. We have also not enough resources in the special school. So mostly you find that most of them don't get enough from the school, and the parent fear taking them there. So sometimes they just remain at home, no education, no job. It is that means the parents will be responsible for that child all throughout the years, and which is not bad. It's unfair to the people with the disability. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Bernadette. Yeah, again, it all comes down to funding, right? How do you get those teachers? How do you get those supplies? And that's a lot of what the government needs to support. Who else can provide that in any society? We have to make a collective choice it's an important thing to put our money into. Lynn, what's your experience with pursuing work, or how do you view these changes impacting the way people with disabilities find employment?
That's a hard question to answer. I know that when I was fresh out of college and looking for a job, I don't think at that point it was so much about discrimination as it was about me being inexperienced, and they were looking for someone with experience. And I mean, now I couldn't even imagine. I think in some ways it's probably better in some ways, but in other ways it's getting worse.
Yeah, I mean, to get experience, you need to have those opportunities, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I'm mentoring people, often it's like, hey, if you're in college, you can't wait till you graduate to go find an internship. You have to start building your resume from like freshman year, looking for those real world connections and other experiences outside of school. And that's just not always accessible. Those are not always available, especially for people with disabilities who have limited time, funding, transportation. If you're on Medicaid, there's so many additional limitations to get those opportunities.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right and spot on. Our third and final question, which if if you're not that tapped into what's going on, which is completely fine um, in your local area. But this conversation is obviously broader, right? Because it's not just our local areas that are being affected. It's couple towns over, next state over, everyone. And so, you know, do you guys know of any programs in your local area that are being impacted by the changes at the DOED or Department of Education? And are there any safeguards to ensure that students get the resources they need? And do you have any experience with the following supports, whether that's a 504 plan, an IEP, things of that nature, as well as like birth to three? Maybe you know somebody who has a child and had to go through birth to three.
And not currently being in school or having children, uh, who obviously would be in school. I'm not that tapped into what's going on in my local town of Stratford. Um, but definitely get the sense that people are nervous and uncertain, especially because if the Department of Education goes away, these services are supposedly going to continue in some fashion, whether it's through another department or what have you. Um, Personally, I'm working full time, running More Than Walking, a nonprofit, working full time for a nonprofit. So I'm enrolled in the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, and that is run by the Department of Education. And I'm up for like completing the 10-year mark this summer. So I'm really hoping, really hoping that that loan forgiveness can pass through before any significant changes happen. But fingers are crossed on that.
So if you remove or take away all of these workers, it ends up being less efficient. I can speak upon our school. We actually here in Connecticut, a student with an IEP. Again, these are special education students. They could be diagnosed as autistic. They have maybe ADHD, ADD, OHI, emotional disturbance issues. These students are highly impacted if they don't have the right amount of services. We are in a deficit here in Connecticut, and we have a shortage of psychologists. So we're currently looking for a psychologist, but the whole state of Connecticut is looking for a psychologist. When you remove, like funds, that impacts the town's budget, that impacts your local budget, that impacts the statewide budget. Students aren't able to receive their services, and in order to keep your services, you have to have a certain amount of meetings, PPTs. A PPT is done for everything and everything. A program review, annual review. These students are going to get impacted where they're out of compliance with their services, and they might not get the special services that they need. I just see it just having a trickling effect where students will fall short again. Parents will complain and do as best as they can to fight for their students, but I think in the long run, we're going to see a shortage of everything by taking away Department of Education funds. We're going to see it impact not only your younger youth, you're going to see it impact your adults, your college students. There might be less funding for Pell Grants, like loan forgiveness we're hoping it doesn't go away, but loan forgiveness might be impacted. Students, I mean, the research, everything is going, they've cut. They've already cut student, I think it was teacher funding for research. I had, parents, I had clients in my other job that went out and protested against the student funding. It's going to impact teachers throughout the country. And I feel as though this is the wrong decision. They might be able to tweak it here and there, but I think Department of Education, it's going to be highly impacted from all aspects.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we just gotta kind of like watch out and look at, you know, each unwinding kind of news segment as it pertains to it and how everyone's going to respond to it. But the whole point is to try to be proactive about it. And I would say to any parent that's viewing this that you are pretty much the first line of defense in your child's education experience. So don't wait for the school system to be reactive to these changes. Be engaged at those PTO meetings. It raised concerns at parent-teacher conferences because many of the teachers are parents, and many of the teachers have children with special needs, and they're just as worried about their little ones as you are. So I don't know about any direct programs currently in Bloomfield that's being impacted. What I do know is that speaking to my son, who has a 504 plan, we've had to contact Birth to Three, which I'll briefly explain what that is to everyone if you're not familiar with those items. So, for example, if your child isn't sitting up by a certain time or crawling or walking by a certain time, you can contact Birth to Three, which is a program that is in part brought because of IDEA, which is Individual Education Disability Act. And so part of that act allows for early intervention into your child's life to ensure that they have success in wherever they could be struggling with learning. At the point in time, my children did not qualify for services because they were able to display. But as a parent, I tried to take preventative measures because I wanted to make sure if my child needed something that I can start now instead of waiting later, and then they get into the school system and then the school doesn't know what to do with them. 504 plans, they're important. They give your child, and we haven't spoken about this enough, John, but children have such anxiety. They're overwhelmed by the workload in school. They're overloaded when they get home because they have additional responsibilities. And so, they freak out about these things. And where do they act out? School. And so if you're acting out in school, what can't you do? You can't concentrate during a test. You can't receive the information that the teacher is teaching. And so you'll find yourself getting in trouble. And so for my children, who, they both have, one has ADHD, the other has ADD, any little distraction kind of makes them veer off. So with a 504 plan, they're able to be separated from the pack and get extra time taking a test. They get more support with things like Lunch Bunch, where a group of kids, usually 4 to 6 or so, they sit together at lunch and they have almost like a gathering where they can discuss things amongst themselves directly with their teacher, and it helps them to excel. How do I know this is true? Because my son has always been on honor roll or high honors since 5th grade because of early intervention, because as a parent, we were active in saying, you know what, my child needs a little bit of help in this area. So therefore, we're going to go speak to a psychologist. We're going to speak to the social worker at school, and we're going to meet with the principal. We're going to talk to whomever we have to so that my child can get from point A to point Z seamlessly. And, going back to the Department of Education, like we talked about before, discrimination is real. I agree with Brandon. Should be able to look at an application and say, you know what? I prefer this individual because I think they'll fit within our team or group setting. But the truth of the matter is, that's why they do the in-person interview, because they want to see who you are and really separate you from the pack. But, Bernadette, in Kenya, do you see or understand any of the things that help protect students on your side of the world?
Okay, protection in Kenya student. Okay, funding is not really, the government really don't really fund the school fully. So you find that most of those students who have special needs, it's very hard for them to excel because they don't employ teachers who have the special education to teach the kids. So you find that most of them, when they start from, I don't know what we call them in America, but here we call them nursery school, from between the age of 3 to 6 before they join the primary school. You find that most of the kids who come to the special school, they are aged. They come when they're around 10 to 11 years to start school because the parents have no money to take care of them. And then when they're taken into a public school, because rarely do we have private school for disabled kids, it's very hard for them to excel, go to employment. You find, unless you fight in Kenya, it's very hard as a disability person to be employed. You have to be a fighter. So the funding is minimal. And also the employment of special, like now the public school I'm teaching, we are teaching with this teacher who are trained to teach in special school. But because the government is not ready to employ them there because they pay more, so they end up in normal school, and the special schools children are suffering. That is a problem we have in Kenya.
Well, yeah. I mean, in order to be able to hire, special needs teachers, you need the training. In order to get the training, you need to have people who know what they're doing, and this kind of comes back to, that job application. If you just look at a piece of paper, one of the challenges is, getting people with diverse experiences outside of, an internship, outside of education. There's so much life experience that we all bring to the table. And oftentimes, in order to get to the point where you have a system that supports special needs, where you have a system that really knows what it's talking about in terms of handling people with disabilities, accommodating people with disabilities, empowering people with disabilities, you need people with disabilities at the top of that system, right? You don't go to school for living with a disability. Right? That's not something that you can put on your resume. You can't major. I mean, you can now, but how did we get to that point? People with disabilities had to fight and scramble to the top of these systems and make those departments. Just one added thought on that line. But Brandon or Lynn, have you guys had any experience with any of those accommodations, those 504 plans, IEPs? And have you heard anything in your area before we close out? Brandon, bring it to you first.
Yeah, I've had in the past, my son, he's now he'll be 22 almost, and when he was going through school though, but he had to have an IEP. My brother, both of his kids are autistic, so he's got to deal with IEPs. So I have a little bit of knowledge of that, but from it's not even in the same realm of what my knowledge is. And then what I'm dealing with school, I don't have any of the and I know of any of the things that are being affected directly in my area, but that's my knowledge.
Thanks for sharing that, Brandon. Lynn, how about you?
I know that when I was, I think ever since I can remember, I had some kind of learning disability where I did need more time when taking tests and things like that. So those are I've had experience with those for a long time. After my being disabled, it just obviously grew significantly. I don't know about what's going on in my area. I know the broad picture.
There's so many things to keep track of, and I'm so happy that Bernadette was able to join us, to bring an international perspective to this discussion. I mean, I would just maybe summarize my thoughts by saying that this issue of the Department of Education here in the U.S., what's happening with it, there's so many different ways that it is involved in our lives that we may or may not be aware of. But we're also dealing with, we have our culture wars. Every country around the world has its culture disagreements, cultural issues. Um, but here in the States, where higher education, we have up until this point really kind of embraced and thrived in an environment where free speech, where you're able to speak your mind peacefully, where you're able to write letters in your school newspaper and not be afraid about what's going to happen to you, having disagreements and being able to express that and explore that. Like, that is the ability to exercise that is absolutely essential for disability rights to thrive and to increase and to expand, no matter where you live. And so when we see that happening here in the US for students on foreign visas, on student visas, and that's a really scary thing and something that we should care about. Or if, you see LGBTQ plus students having their Section 504 accommodations being threatened, and 17 states suing to say that Section 504 is completely unconstitutional, completely. Like, that would affect people with disabilities as well, like, because of anxiety accommodations and other accommodations that students get. That's something that we should be concerned with and educate ourselves about. So there's so many different ways that that it affects our lives. We just need to be able to track it and stay aware.
Yeah, man. I think that was well said, because it's true. Um, we can't ignore population groups. We can't attack the idea of speaking out against something you differ from with threats to pulling funding. Um, and there needs to be more awareness and recognition so that maybe we don't have to have such deep conversations about whose life matters more, and what have you. You know, as Bernadette was talking, you know, I think it puts a spotlight on why we even have DEIA in the first place. Because at one point in time in our nation, children with disabilities could not even enter school. And where did that leave them? Institutionalized. Now we're talking about lacking and not showing the full potential of how many students, you set the clock back, 60, 70, 80 years ago. Those people, where did they end up in society? But then you have someone like Bernadette, who has a disability, and many others who are very capable of teaching. You have Lynn as an example of still being able to coach. John going back to India with his disability and starting a rugby team for a nation, not just a small group of individuals. And then on the flip side of it, you have people in the education system like Amy, who is striving to help protect those children. And she needs to be able to go to work confident that she has the resources to help those students. And, Brandon, he's going to school. He's not just sitting around collecting some check or anything. He's actually trying to further himself so that when you look at his education credentials, that's what you see as a man who is striving. And then when you see him in person, you can then understand the story about overcoming adversity. And I think when we have the backing and support of the federal government, in many cases and instances, it gives the public more reassurance. Don't believe me? Take a look at, 1 minute we're going to do tariffs. Next minute, if we call it off and the stock market jumps up. It's the same thing. There's a confidence boost in what our federal government does and what politicians are saying. And so, we hope that this conversation will expand beyond just our group, but to the viewers out there, And, leave in the comments your views on the Department of Education, good, bad, or indifferent, so that we can talk about it and lessen the disparities that ultimately our children will have to pay for in the end. So thank you guys so much for joining us and participating in our More Than Walking video podcast discussion.
Stay tuned in and sign up for the More Than Walking newsletter at morethanwalking.com to learn about the topic we will cover next and how you can participate. Also, like, comment, and subscribe to our More Than Walking YouTube channel to watch each podcast, and click that notification bell so you are alerted when new episodes drop. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for More Than Walking or Super Adaptables.
And until then, remain encouraged, stay hopeful, and above all else,
Keep adapting.